We've moved on from that to practices that are going to benefit everybody in showing their potential.
So welcome to today's episode of Higher Education Matters. Today we're going to be talking about inclusive assessment in higher education and the journey of which the sector has generally gone on and where we are now as an institution. I'm James Hazzard and I'm Director of Education and Deputy Head of School of Education and Childhood. And today joining me we have Antony Hill, who is Dean of Learning and Teaching for the College of Health Science and Society, and Carolyn Paul, who is Deputy Head of School for the School of Social Sciences. So we're kind of following on from another podcast that we did a few episodes ago where we were looking at inclusive assessment at a kind of more granular level within practice. So we looked at some of the inclusive assessment that some particular programs are exploring as part of a pilot, as well as some of the work that the university more generally is engaging with. But today is kind of taking a step back from that, looking at it from a slightly sort of bigger picture perspective, and to see sort of identify what inclusive assessment is and how it's defined, and I suppose have a bit of a look at its evolution. So to sort of start us off then, what is inclusive assessment really, and what does it mean within higher education?
Wow, very good question. Of course, inclusive assessment as a terminology has altered over the years. So traditionally, not very many years ago, when we talked about inclusive assessment, we were really thinking about how we addressed individual student needs, particularly around disability and access to teaching, learning and assessment. But of course, we've moved on from that now to think more about practices that are going to benefit everybody in showing their potential, in being able to access successfully that assessment task and the successful outcome that we hope comes from it.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with that. And it's kind of why I'm always a bit on the fence about the terminology, which is exactly as you say, it's the thing as it's evolved, because it sort of, it does have that element of meaning that two things. And I agree, there's the evolution piece, which we can absolutely explore, where it started, what it meant in a bit more of a targeted way. But it also represents good practice, and that's why it's a really interesting. It's why the terminology can kind of people can connect to or disconnect to, because it sometimes can do other things. But yeah, it's part of the evolution, I guess, more than anything else. But
is there a kind of generally agreed upon kind of definition now, or different institutions tend to look at it very differently? From inclusive assessment, inclusive practice, universal design. What is the variation? Why are they slightly nuanced?
Google is your friend here, I think. If you Google inclusive assessment, higher education, then everybody has their own version out there in terms of what inclusive assessment is, and they seem to range from quite traditional places in terms of focusing on simply making sure there's a variety of assessment across the programme, variety of timings, etc., to a very much broader understanding, including not just the styles, but the choice, the personalisation, the authenticity of the assessment framework. So yes, there are a lot of different.
Right.
Do you think it's used as a proxy for people's idea about good assessment then? Because I couldn't agree more. I think the thing is there is such a spread of that terminology, but it's quite often used just as a, inclusive assessment is used as a proxy for assessment design in an institution.
Yeah, I guess so, and I guess that comes back to the good practice approach in terms of what we understand.
Yeah.
It is a tricky one, because again, I think the problem is we're trying to almost say, here is the definition, trying to say this is the exact definition of inclusive assessment. But I think a healthy way of looking at it is exactly as you were saying, Carolyn. It's about, it means different things to different people. I mean,
For sure.
But that in itself can create the challenge, but I think it does mean different things to different people.
So later on, we're going to talk about QAA project, and even as part of that, as a group of researchers from a range of institutions, we had to agree what we felt inclusive assessment was in order to ensure that we landed the piece well and that we had a shared vision. Yeah. So within the report there is a statement that we came out with in terms of our understanding.
So before we look at it then, would that be interesting for us? What would be our shared definition of inclusive assessment then? How would we, because we've all got a slightly different nuance on this and what it means. So you're obviously saying more about the practice of assessment, making sure that it's fair and equitable and accessible, etc., and that it kind of offers the best opportunities. And then we're talking about you were talking more about diverse learning needs, etc. So is that all part of it? Is there a way of kind of condensing that, or is it that complicated? Because inclusive assessment, sometimes I think it's focusing on assessment itself, but when you look at some of the definitions, it's so much bigger than just assessment, isn't it? It's huge.
It is. So our position statement is not short, okay? And it has lots of great words in it. I mean, holistic is one word that keeps coming out, the fact that you can't just focus on the assessment task.
Right.
It is the bigger picture, so the whole journey to that assessment point. So how students have been scaffolded through the programme to that point, not necessarily just through the module.
Okay, and what do you think it means? Where were we currently at UWE with our kind of definitions? And we touched on this sort of kind of last time in the last podcast, and it was not very straightforward. It's complicated. But where do you think we are as an institution now when we consider inclusive assessment?
I think it is meant to be more, as exactly as you saying, Carolyn, that holistic piece. That it can't be something that's just about an assessment being very specific or being varied. It is that holistic piece and how it interconnects. Could I just be cheeky and segue? I know we're going to talk about the QA project, but how difficult was that conversation about getting I'm just really interested in that. About, when you're having that big debate, because it was a big project, lots of universities, how difficult was that debate?
At the end of the day, it wasn't too difficult because we'd all interviewed and experienced aspects of inclusive assessment within our own institutions, and there were common themes and trends that we could pull out. And then it was more about how do we articulate that? How do we land it? So we were all coming from a shared point, but it was really important to capture that and to frame that. Yeah. So it did come down to semantics of words at the end of the day.
Right. And it's just interesting, when you've got such a difficult subject and lots of different angles.
Yeah, it was one of the sandpit events where we were all, working together and coming up with the shared position.
Right.
And it wasn't too traumatic in the end. No. So you might think it was, but no, it wasn't.
No, it's just interesting when you talk about definitions, that's all.
Yeah, no, completely. And I suppose, did people's definitions, they've obviously got their own experiences and views around inclusive assessment, but were they led, do you think, by their institutional position as well? Did the institutional drive for inclusive assessment influence, or did, I suppose, do people have an influence on do these people have an influence on their institution's standpoint? Interesting.
It really depends on the individual and their position within that university. Right. Within the project, we had a range of people, from those that were practitioners to those that were policymakers, and everybody in between. Mm-hmm. So everybody's ability to inform that in their own institution will have been different. Right. No, it's interesting. Coming back to the original point about where we are here, the UWE programmes work at the moment. I think it's helpful that programmes are being asked to review the work with those lenses, because a lot of those lenses are driven by inclusive assessment, and match a lot of the attributes that we've seen in the work that we've done. Yeah. So having that holistic view when you're looking at a programme is really useful in arriving at an inclusive assessment final position. Moving on from that then, and I suppose looking at the evolution of inclusive assessment and I suppose the journey that it's been on, how have we kind of got to a place where we've needed to have something called inclusive assessment? Obviously it wasn't there at the beginning, but where have we got to, where it's evolved, where it's gone on the trajectory that it has to get us to where we are now?
Well, just broadly, before diving into assessment, I think, and not going over an area I've talked in another podcast, but I think the journey of the sector has been quite substantial over the past, even just a couple of decades. The profile of learning teaching, much more consideration of the student experience, some of the quality drivers that sit around it. That talk about fees and stuff, but it is actually, the profile and the focus on student experience has massively increased over the past couple of decades, and that goes hand in hand with assessment. It can't not in many ways. So I appreciate that's a broader point, but actually I think it is, and it's not that actually people have suddenly started caring about assessment and assessment and teaching where they didn't previously, but I think it's more that institutions have had to be accountable and have had to engage more. So I appreciate it's broad, but that does a link into assessment.
Also, the demographic of the learners have changed across the sector. So we have had to adapt. The traditional methods haven't necessarily suited the learners coming in. And we've perhaps been rather comfortable in the past in terms of sticking with what we've traditionally done, sticking with our own experience of assessment, and maybe not looking much further beyond that. There's also an aspect of certain styles of assessment that become embedded within disciplinary constructs and expectations around that discipline. So at some point these have become hardwired in terms of expectations. So lifting the lid on that and trying to move beyond has been interesting.
And I think we briefly touched on that just before when we were having a sit down and chat, how the experiences of the lecturers and their kind of more, I suppose, how it's drilled in their views of assessment and how they're delivered, as well as the school system and how students have come to us with being taken on a certain journey through exams and through coursework and how they're assessed. So it's almost like we reach HE, and is there more potential here to make those changes, albeit frightening and taking a risk? But HE seems to have a bit more autonomy to be flexible with how we can assess. But is it too late in the journey?
I would say it's ever too late. What I would acknowledge doing that is I think we do have a jolt going from level 3 into level 4, coming into higher education, in the level of independence. It's not that there's less structure, but there's the different set of expectations. I know over the years we've got much better about supporting students as they transition, but that level of independence is different. We do tend to potentially, ironically, have a larger scope of assessments and potentially more what we can do. But it's also that complicated element of, and it's not that all our students are sort of 18 when they come, but a large portion are, but it's moving into adulthood, and that's quite a different shift. And I think when it comes to assessment, there is a certain level of independence, I guess, that we introduced quite quickly that wouldn't necessarily have been before. There was an interesting point made in a different space, actually, about the shift, which I touched on briefly, that say, I don't know, A-levels is a traditional way and GCSEs, again, traditional, is that it tends to be more based on exams, but exam is done by someone else who's external. It's not the person teaching you. It's sort of, there's an external element which is doing that. It's an interesting point in another podcast someone made, actually. Whereas actually when you get to university, you are talking to the people who are assessing you. And that is quite a different space. And I think that's why when you start thinking about inclusive assessment, you have a power dynamic in a different way, and that's why the holisticness matters so much, because it's everything around it, because it's not that it's been done by someone you never meet. You're actually you're seeing and interacting with the person who's going to be doing the assessment, regardless of what the assessment is, regardless of the structure around it. There is still a judgment element, and that's quite different.
It is, and the communication in that relationship is really important. But it's interesting thinking about teaching and assessment pre-university, so that the students tend to be taught with a view to doing that assessment. So it's focused on that external, isn't it, point, rather than focus purely on the learning and the ability to learn. So it's all focused on how to win that final assessment point, and that there's an element of that as well. At university, in that students worry about, what is it that I have to do? What is it that I have to produce in order to please my marker? And I think as academics, we need to be very aware of what we're assessing, and that we've developed an appropriate and a fair assessment, and not one that somehow mirrors our approach to writing or the topic, and we're not generating sort of mini versions of ourselves, in that this must be good because they are replicating what I understand to be, the appropriate tone and style and one I use. So yes, moving beyond those biases in terms of our own understanding and values.
And interestingly, just adding on from that, with our conversations recently around the change of the sector and changing the change of the student dynamic, there was, obviously if you look back 20, 30 years, the accessibility of HE was quite narrow with regards to how it is now. So the successful students that would come into university would be the straight A students, obviously, that would come from schools, and then would be potentially geared more to that style of learning. Obviously, the student dynamic has changed, and now with widening participation, you've got all manner of students. The numbers have exploded, really. And I remember years ago, inclusive assessment, or being inclusive, was kind of a term, I guess, used for a student with an element that was neurodiverse or that had a certain learning disposition and it was kind of a bit of a stigma in having an inclusive part of it. It's like, I'm somebody that gets inclusive assessment or support, and now it's just been broadened out to cover the whole breadth of students and make sure that it's not just for a particular element of neurodiversity, for example, but it's for everyone to achieve in the most fair and equitable way. So it's the student population, do you think, that's driven the increase in inclusive assessment?
Undoubtedly, it will have played a big part in terms of that development, understanding the students that we have, and also understanding what they bring with them. So we're quite happy to accept a variety of qualifications. So it isn't just A levels that we accept in our entry qualifications. And with that must come a realisation that the assessments and the pathway that they've taken is different, and therefore the skills through which they've evidenced themselves and their abilities will have been different. So we need to change also to recognise that.
I do agree with that. The only thing I would add, just looking at it from a different angle, is, although I do agree, I think the diversity of the students, but I think we also have to acknowledge that there was a long period, and it's not until more recently, where, and it's something actually you said, Carolyn, I think earlier, is that assessment wasn't really thought about in design. It was just something you did at the end. It just happened, and it's not been critical of exams, particularly, or say writing an essay or anything like that. They have an absolute purpose in the right space in the right way. But I think historically we wouldn't necessarily been considered. That actually, that of how, I'll use that generic phrase, but it does make sense. Assessment sort of instead of assessment over learning, it's assessment, as learning. Exactly. So it is, and I don't think that was particularly considered that much in the past. And individuals, would do, but there was no sort of, say, institutional drive. So what you ended up with was, what were the traditional assessments, and you did exactly the same. I remember when I started teaching, just do exactly the same what everyone done previously, and it was really interesting. You were talking about that professional identity. And I think part of that's linked to that, and perhaps some of the more resistance about evolving that, is it's associated with sort of this idea that you're somehow damaging quality, you're damaging standards by not doing what came before. And I think that is actually, and there's a fear part of that, but that is something that sits with it. And there's this idea that if you're making something more inclusive, it's somehow making it easier, which is, I know it's a slightly different topic, but it's sort of tied up with this, that if you're somehow considering, but it's how you approach it. If you're considering assessment, making it the best it can be, and it's all part of a wider journey, absolutely. But it's interesting, quite often you get this interpretation that somehow making it easier.
Yeah, we're so much a product of our own experience of assessment as well. So, for some to step beyond that, to break what has become the norm or appears to be the norm by experience, it's quite scary. But it's also a really interesting space. And once you do step into that space to see how the students, blossom, are differently motivated, is a really great thing.
No, I was going to say, just riffing off that, I wonder where we've gone a bit more towards thinking about the skills and what students gain from assessment, because I think traditionally, I think back for myself, we tended just to assess knowledge, And I would be perfectly candid. I think the reason I had success academically is I could learn knowledge in large amounts and do exams, which isn't a great learning experience, but it's how we're sort of set up. And exams do have a place. I'm not completely dismissing them at all, but it's interesting. But I'm not sure what I really gained from that. But that's quite, it's just, the evolution's quite interesting. Right?
Yeah, and it's also interesting that we assume that students are going to be as interested in and motivated by the particular topics that we choose to teach on as well in the subject. So, you know, being open to opening up that curriculum to allow students to find their space for motivation so they can, you know, personalise the assessment and demonstrate their true ability in a space that they're truly motivated by.
With both staff, academics and students being sort of, I suppose, funneled into a way of thinking and assessing, etc., and that's been the norm for, you know, generations. And change is obviously quite frightening, and taking a risk is, you know, you're taking a risk with, you know, people's jobs, people's education, the success of the institution. So it's naturally something that people are fearful of. People could be fearful of stepping outside of how they want to assess, and likewise students are geared into a way of feeling comfortable maybe about exams or comfortable about writing an essay. So what's the driver for inclusive assessment then? Who's driving it? Is it feedback from students that want change, or is it researchers in pedagogy that want change? Where does it come from? Because I can't imagine anyone's just come out with it, because it is scary to step out of that comfort zone, because you know you've developed skills in those 18 years to be successful in one or the other, or you probably wouldn't be at university. So where's it coming from?
I mean, there's lots of commentators in the literature critiquing, obviously, what has gone before, and debating whether we can generate a social justice through assessment. One of the interesting reflections is that in the past we have undertaken a sort of procedural fairness. So we've designed our policies and regulations such that as there are boundaries around it, and we have deemed it that if everybody follows the particular procedures, so then the process is fair. You know, at its base level, that's the sort of word count that's handing in by a certain deadline, not a second after, you know, and we need to apply these so it's a fair landscape. So this procedural fairness has dominated some of our thinking, but it hasn't necessarily enabled students to demonstrate A, true learning, and B, true ability.
Right, and that's been, say, more staff-driven, research-driven within social justice researchers. That's the driver for that change.
I think we are evolving away from just a procedural kind of approach. However, we've got to recognise that no matter what we do, we are bounded by our procedures and policies. So having the space to reflect on that, having leadership at the higher education institution that is willing to look at that is an important part of being able to move forward as an institution as well.
I do wonder on that as well, because I agree with that entirely. There's not the negative side, but like there is an element with this. And if I put, I know it sounds ridiculous, but if I put student experience to one side, which drives it as well, but also the narrative of the past few years, and part of it is how fees work, is the value out of degrees. Now, I appreciate that it sounds like I'm moving to a very negative topic, but it's related to what you're saying, Carolyn. It's the value of degrees has been looked at more. You know, what are students getting out of degrees? Now, that is driven to an extent by experience, but it's had that sort of wide scrutiny. So what's interesting is if we look at like the introduction of the teaching excellence framework and elements like that, has driven more looking at things like graduate outcomes. It's driven more looking at, National Student Survey, if we're talking about the undergraduate space. And that, when you start being pushed in that direction, again, it's not like that is the thing, but it's part of the mix. You do, by definition, start looking, well, actually, what are students getting out of it? You know, actually, are the students leaving degrees with that broader range of skills that they need? And one of the main, being practical, one of the main mechanisms we do to make that assessment is assessment. You know, and how we assess. And there is an element which we, with the best of the world, it's part of it is what we assess does place value on what is within the degree. I mean that may be a slightly controversial way of putting it, but it's true. You know, the reality of how it's viewed is what we assess puts value. That's what we value.
That's what students value. That's what they take part in, isn't it? So, if they do one thing, it's the assessment, and so that's also what drives what we put in assessment, because we know that that's what drives the students. But you mentioned earlier about the sort of skills in assessment, and clearly it's important to have variety in order to capture that skills development that may be happening elsewhere, but you need to demonstrate that the student has it, and it's helpful to the student as a graduate to be able to say, look, here is evidence of. So that skills piece is really helpful, and I think that's where the authentic phrasing comes in as well. And I think people get a little bit hung up on authentic, and it's more providing the context with which the student can appreciate the value of creating, for instance, a written argument. There is value in structuring it well and putting across your point well. However, they can better critique their ability to do this if they understand the context and the audience. So that, I think, is where the authentic aspect comes in, that framing of that.
That is beautifully described. I think the only reason, because I appreciate we're chatting before, that I sometimes react to certain terminologies is more how you manage the other side of that. Because, of course, as soon as you say this is an authentic assessment, it has an implication that others isn't authentic. It's the challenge of saying inclusive assessment, then it implies that others aren't inclusive. And it's not saying that's not the case, and that doesn't need tackling, but it's quite interesting. But it's all about the motivation, because that was just brilliantly described, what authentic assessment is, what it's meant to do. I guess it's how we sort of, and in a funny way, you kind of want a mix of different things. I think that's the thing. It's that mix is kind of so essential. But
we've had a conversation in our teams about the proud moments. What is it that the students do in their programme that they're really proud of, that they're going to carry with?
That's great.
They're going to carry with them, and often it comes down to those sort of seminal pieces of assessment where they've had great independence, that they were able to personalise it, and they were truly motivated, and often learnt through that assessment, that particular
I'm so going to nick that now.
You can't, it's on video.
I'm shameless, it's fine, I'm going to do it.
We're going to do it anyway.
Okay, well that sort of leads us to the next part then, really, which is beginning to introduce the research that's going on. So I think we've sort of, to many ways, sort of thrashed out some really interesting elements of inclusive assessment, its definitions, its origins, its evolution from our perspective, obviously. And that leads on to some of the work that you're doing with the QAA more generally, which has been really interesting, I think, to be able to have a discussion around that. And what first of all, I suppose, what got you into it, and what brought you to that particular project, and then what's going on within it at the moment.
I was fortunate to be working with Laura Bennett, who was here at the university at the time, and was linked into a piece of work funded by the QAA involving a number of institutions from across the University Alliance. And the work was looking at what happened during the pandemic, looking at all of the assessment change that very rapidly happened, the policy regulatory framework that sat behind that very rapid change, and then undertaking some focus groups within institutions to explore what had happened, particularly focusing on where the data demonstrated that there had been reductions in the warding gaps in the first year, and then improvements in continuation in the second year. So it was based on the data, looking at programmes where there had been these improvements in various KPIs, and then homing in on those staff and students to explore what had changed during that period. And from that, thematic analysis of the interviews was undertaken, and we pulled out those various themes that informed what inclusive assessment means in terms of attributes. So what are the attributes of inclusive assessment?
Okay.
And yeah, we identified 9, so it sounds like quite a long list, but through those 9, we were able to recognise the various case studies that we'd pulled out. And not every case study obviously spoke to all 9 attributes, but it drew on and evidenced a number of those. And then from that, we wanted to generate an output that was useful to the sector, so we generated a toolkit based on those attributes, so that teams could interrogate the assessment that they were currently doing, whether it was an individual piece, whether it was a whole module, whether it's a whole programme. And we produced a series of questions based on the attributes around that, to what extent. And there's a panel of questions for 3 different sets of stakeholders, leaders and policy makers, academics, and the students themselves. And ideally, in order to bring about a sustainable change in inclusive assessment, you would want to pull in all of those stakeholders.
And I love how you split that actually in the work, that it was split into those 3 groups, because I know what you mean. You have to think about them separately because there's different questions or different lenses.
Definitely, and far too often we make assumptions about what we think students' perceptions are, what we think their experiences are, and we can only know by asking them and pulling them into the piece and doing some co-creation.
So you'd use the attributes as a framework in which to judge what those groups were doing then? They would assess their own practices based upon those attributes.
That's the idea for the toolkit. So that's published on the QAA site, so anybody can download that and use that. The idea is to initially use the questions to rate where you are at the moment, then to propose some change, undertake some change, and then to sort of rate to what extent you think you've moved that narrative on.
What's the next steps for us then? Where are we? Obviously, where are we taking inclusive assessment further, I suppose? So we've got some useful ways of looking at it, assessing it. What do you reckon is going to happen in the next 5 years?
I want just to pick up something you were saying, Cameron, because there's a few bits I wanted to mention on that. But I think the core design is a big one that we're very good at. Not very good necessarily doing, but very good at saying we core design. But the reality of that is it's still quite a difficult thing to do. But I think that's probably the next big transformation.
Really, I think we should, just be a bit more open to that. So, just recently, module that I'm involved in, the assessment has changed. We kind of think we know, what it is that we're doing. I say kind of think. That sounds very loose indeed. But we've put together the instructions for students, but it's the first time through. So the most obvious thing to do was to run those past students. So module leader conducted a focus group with a number of student volunteers, and that wording has been amended, and then that feeds into obviously the importance of communication, the importance of academic literacy or assessment literacy, and the product is going to be more accessible to students.
And this is accessible through the QAA website for people to see the report and obviously use the attributes, I suppose.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yes, and there was a follow-on study. So there was subsequent funding through the UA to follow up and assess to what extent those inclusive practices that came in during COVID have been sustained, which was an interesting piece, and looking at what in that subsequent period of time, what were enablers and what were barriers to sustaining that piece. So it was quite an interesting. Again, there were a number of case studies that we looked at, and we ran a number of sector workshops subsequently as well, and a number of participants from across the UK joined, and again evaluated the original 9 attributes in terms of what they perceived or what they had found to be enablers or barriers to actually enacting those. So we've got quite a rich data set now in terms of perspective from the sector.
What were examples of some of those 9 attributes then?
So the inclusive assessment attributes requires considerate policies and processes. We've mentioned the sort of policy process framework or landscape a number of times. communicate meaningfully, develop assessment literacy, embed support. That's an interesting one because I think we sometimes see that as sitting external to what we do, to the assessment itself. But in the sector workshops, looking at enablers and barriers and what they'd found to be helpful when they were ranking these attributes, they ranked embed support highly every time. So provides formative opportunities, so that's sitting separate to the support. Obviously, formative opportunities is supportive in its own right, but identified there as a specific attribute. Fosters digital capabilities is an interesting one. Obviously, coming out of COVID, that was a really important attribute during that period. In terms of the value of that as an attribute since, that's tended to rank lower down, which is quite interesting.
Oh, that is interesting. Anyway, so
it's quite interesting. Enable personalisation, so students really value that. Promotes authenticity, again, great value in terms of providing context and meaning to the student. And requires continuous reflection, so that fact that it's not a static landscape. We can't, so that's inclusive assessment, and we'll aim for that point today. Because everything's changing, the students that we're teaching will continue to evolve in terms of their prior experiences, their needs. So it's a moving picture.
But something it's holistic. That, it's that thing you were talking about earlier. It's that it's holistic, and it's about what does that holistic good practice look like. But that's great. If we could manage that. That would be, that would be incredible. The other thing, as I said, what I like about it is you said multiple times, it's the holistic element. It's about everything around it as well and how it interconnects.
Beginning to sort of draw to a close then, last sort of couple of areas to look at unless we've got some other questions we can come to, is what do you think we need to do as an institution next? What's next on the agenda for UWE? I know obviously UWE Programmes plays a role in starting that journey, but as you say, it doesn't end. It's an iterative process that needs
long term as well.
It's longer term. So we're trying to get things, or through UWE Programmes, get programmes in place and get them to consider more elements of inclusivity with regards to assessment, etc., course design. Where do we need to go as an institution? What's next?
Well, I think we talked a little bit about core design, which I think is a practice, which I think is very good to do. I think there's probably more a sector shift that just needs considering, and that's obviously we've got the introduction of the lifelong learning entitlement coming in, which does, again, I'm not commenting on it directly, but what that does lend the direction towards is being more modular, and what works really well, and it's part of great design, is being quite programmatic, thinking about the full experience, going back to your work, Carol, what's the full experience, what that is, and as soon as you start breaking up into modular design, very individual modular design that is interconnected, that's quite different. That is actually from an assessment point of view, although obviously you have an assessment side of module, quite difficult to connect up. So it's not that actually lifelong learning entitlement necessarily, I think it's a good thing to do, but it's how it's managed. So I think, in a way, you speak about institutionally, instead of saying, right, we're going to offer everything as modules and people just collect a load of modules and that's how it's going to work. I don't feel that would work from a programmatic point of view. However, if we had groupings of modules that has an umbrella and how that sits, we could try and get some sort of assessment strategy. It's like, I know it sounds like I'm segueing, but actually, how funding is going to work for students is going to change quite substantially shortly, in that technically they're going to be funded via modules. It's not going to be technically via programmes, and people will have access to wider loans more broadly. So I think it's holding the line of programmatic design and how that matters. And when people do want to come back and say doing from more CPD aspect, that in itself is separate. It's in a framework and how that sits. So, because I think if we don't consider it, it's like the ecosystem point. If we don't consider some of the drivers, we end up drifting almost in a different direction and losing some sight of some of the great stuff that we've really evolved. So
yeah, and in that scenario you're just talking about, that I think the way holistic is framed needs to be looked at differently, because holistic in terms of time covers a much broader piece then. And trying to build that supportive framework is going to be very much more difficult if it's not being experienced in a single block. I've been chatting to mature students recently, and those returners after a period of 10, 15 years find it very difficult to get back into academic learning and assessment, and their confidence in their abilities is often a large part of what's holding them back. Yeah. So if we've got people continually returning, potentially, then we've got to consider that continual support and building of confidence in a different way. So it's going to be a very different framework, I think, going forward, if it pans out in the way you suggest.
But it does have quite a big impact on assessment.
Yeah, no doubt, and something we need to be proactive with, by the sounds of it.
I mean, one thing, again, it would be an entirely separate conversation, but just to throw in the mix, that, I mean, it's hard not to avoid generative AI and its impact on assessment, and without opening up an entirely, big new 1 hour podcast on it, is, I think it does tie into something we talked about a little earlier about almost the reverting to what's seen as traditional forms of assessment, because and I mean, absolutely acknowledge the disruption, the challenge it comes, as well as opportunities. That's, there's a balance to that. But I think it's just make sure we don't lose sight of what we're trying to achieve through assessment. It's not just about going back to all tried and tested and we did that, and because it is so disruptive. I think it's very easy for me to sit here and say, oh, we just embrace AI and it's all be magical. But it is about but it's all about the experience, come back in that holisticness, and there's a way of bringing this in and still keeping holistic assessment, but there's a lot of evolution and rethinking done that needs in that space. And I appreciate that's a huge area, but
yeah, I think we've got a podcast series around AI. I think that's going to come our way. We've done one already on the introduction of it, but AI in assessment, I think, is more of a debate we'd like to run. I think.
But it touches on sort of the disruption and how we manage disruption, because I remember things like introducing Google, SMLs. I know the different things, and the impact is different, but it's funny how we sort of almost feel like we need to go back to traditional methods.
Yeah. Controlling what we feel we can control. Ultimately we've got to go back to, critiquing what it is that we're truly assessing if we go back to certain traditional methods. Yeah. And being honest with whether or not we are truly enabling students to demonstrate their abilities. So it's going to be uncomfortable for a while, but if we continue to be honest with ourselves and critical in terms of our approaches, then hopefully we will find a way through.
Okay. Right, probably a good time to draw to a close then, I think. Thank you for joining today's podcast, and thanks very much to my guests for joining. Please like and subscribe.